I want to go ahead and open with a passage to tone set for this morning. A quote that Caroline and I were just talking about is particularly powerful. Where else can blackness imagine itself besides the Atlantic? Omise Eki, Natasha Tinsley, a Black Studies scholar. They were navigators, explorers, soldiers, and sailors. Black people made livelihoods upon the Pacific, fishing or whaling the Great Ocean. Others carried cargo across its wide expanse or worked its waterfront docks. Black people surfed, swam, and studied the Pacific. Some participated in colonialist activities that dispossessed indigenous peoples of lands and waterways, while some sought refuge in native societies. Many established communities in Pacific regions. Whether they engaged with what is now known as the U.S. Pacific on shore or at sea, Black folks are a vital part of its history. This exhibit highlights Black folks who took to the Pacific Ocean in ways that transformed their lives, communities, and at times nations between the 1500s and mid-1900s. Their stories are many and their experiences diverse, yet an important thread connects them. Black people have deep ties to the Pacific, despite historical accounts that often ignore or erase them. This rich history is a living one. Black folks to continue to live, work, and play upon the Pacific. Take Me to the Water, Histories of the Black Pacific, celebrates the deep roots of these connections. I want to introduce our visionary curator. Dr. Caroline Collins is an assistant professor of social and spatial justice in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at UC San Diego, where she's also affiliated with the Democracy Lab, the Design Lab, the Indigenous Futures Institute, and the Scripps Center for Marine Archaeology. Her work examines public remembrances of the American West through archival methods, ethnographic study, media production, and public history exhibition. Dr. Collins is currently working with UC Press on her first book manuscript exploring the making of race and place at Old Town San Diego State Historic Park. Her second major research project examines Black folks' long connection to what is now the U.S. Pacific. Dr. Collins' research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Bilo Chacon Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Center, California Humanities, UCSD Frontiers of Innovation Scholars Program, the UC Consortium for Black Studies in California Project, the Herbert I. Schiller Communication Dissertation Fellowship, and the UC Office of the President. Welcome, Dr. Collins. For everyone in the room that's wondering who this lady is and why she's here, my name's Angela Moncada Hewitson. I'm also a fellow San Diegan, and I'm a staff member here at Northwest Maritime. Before my 10 years in Maritime, I studied decolonized research methodologies in East Africa, centering African indigenous knowledge systems in pursuit and support of things like land rights, conservation policies, water developments, and access. Arguably, having that background has shaped my approach within maritime spaces, and my day job now as the Associate Director of Maritime Partnerships is to connect underrepresented communities, particularly Black and Brown youth and their families, to maritime experiences, activities, careers, and stories, in hopes that they too see themselves in this world and thrive in it. As a woman of mixed Mexican descent, how this work is approached is very important to me. And Caroline and I, have been rubbing elbows for almost 3 years now. First, when we received a proposal outlining her mission to accomplish this work in an email, then by her joining us at a conference we hosted in this room 2 years ago through the Teaching with Small Boats Alliance. She presented in this very room a year ago to the day, where admittedly I bawled right over there, knowing how important this work is to our society as a whole. And now I get the supreme honor, oh my God, I didn't want to cry. And now I get the supreme honor of being your interviewer. Oh, full circle. Okay. More importantly, I am your super fan, and now we get to discuss your exhibit at the front entrance of the Wooden Boat Festival. Welcome. So I want to start off with your origin story, and I want to talk about when did this begin and what brought you to this work?
Well, first, thank you for that beautiful introduction. Thank you for everyone for coming to listen to the conversation. All honor to all of the First Nations who were first on these lands before we were here. And also, I just want to give a shout out to the Northwest Maritime Center and just how welcoming y'all have always been. So much of my research is looking at the ways Black folks have often tried to find belonging in certain spaces. And I love the water, but I've never known anything about like making boats or and when I reached out to you, you all have always just been really welcoming. This has been a welcoming space, so I'm so happy to be here. But in terms of the origins, I mean, if I were to go way back, I grew up in San Diego on the water. My family and I were always in the water and on it. And specifically on the Pacific. But about 10 years ago, I think I started thinking even more deeply and maybe scholarly about all of this. I was working with a group called Native Like Water in San Diego. I still have deep ties to, and that program is really about rekindling and fostering indigenous relationships to water, especially with youth. And some of that process at the same time when I was doing my doctoral research on Old Town San Diego State Historic Park, I was really interested in this Black mariner named Allen B. Light. The reason why he's important to Old Town in its park form is in the 1940s, some of his 19th century documents were found within the walls of this a 19th century adobe, one of our historic structures in Old Town. And one of those papers were his sailors' protection papers, his seamen's protection papers. And so as I was writing for my research on Old Town about the way in which his story was kind of left out of the public history project of Old Town, I started becoming more and more interested, not just how he and his papers were left out of that story, but just thinking about how did he get to San Diego in the first place when it was Alta California in the 1830s, and thinking about his journey that he made from the eastern seaboard around Cape Horn. He was reportedly on the Pilgrim, the same vessel that Dana had been on when he wrote 2 years before the Mass. So that story is really kind of what got me just thinking about this and thinking about when I would share that story that sometimes folks seemed surprised by it. But I knew that Black folks had this long connection with the Pacific. So that's just kind of what had me delve into it.
Thank you for that. When approaching, and I know when we had these conversations often, actually, when approaching Black connections to water and boats, particularly using a historical lens, often the first thing that comes to mind is rooted in historical trauma. Can you talk about how that work is informed by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it was really important to recognize that and to recognize all of the really important work that has taken place around Black folks' relationship to water as rooted in trauma. Often when people do think about Black people's relationships to water, especially here in the US, the first thing that comes to mind is the slave ship. The first body of water that comes to mind is the Atlantic. And that's all for really important reasons, that the transatlantic slave trade has had all kinds of long-reaching implications that still impact us to this day. But it was also important for me that this story wasn't really an either or. I wasn't discounting that history, but this was really a yes and. Like, yes, that is important history, and that doesn't tell the complete story of Black folks' relationships to water, and that Black people have traversed all sorts of bodies of water, including the Pacific, and they've done it in ways that have included enslavement and also included voluntary forms of transportation on the water as well. And so it was just really important to me that if we could get folks to kind of be jarred and not just think about the Atlantic as that one geographic site of people being, Black people being on the water, that could then also just open us up to just thinking about all sorts of ways that Black people were engaging with the Pacific.
In Maritime, we often talk about how large the spectrum of activities are in connection to the water. The stories of these people really root you in what you described early in the exhibit as ways of being on the sea. How do you go about describing the breadth of maritime activity now that you've created this exhibit?
That's an interesting question because I feel like I should maybe have more specificity now after being in these archives, but I think the way I think of Maritime has become maybe even more expansive. In the beginning, I was very much thinking of sailors, especially in the age of sail, because I was thinking about Alan B. Light. But the more that I was engaging in this work, the more I was really thinking about just ways of being in and on and near the water. And that included for commercial reasons, but then also thinking about all the forms of leisure and play as well, and then in working on the water and playing in the water and just all the things that the ways that we do life on and in the water. And so I don't think I have a very tight now definition of maritime. When I'm thinking about it just holistically and how it's influenced the work. I think the best way I could describe it is what I was saying earlier, just what it has been like to be in, on, and near the water.
Yeah, I think Port Townsend Wooden Boat Festivals definitely attracts the right community that uses all the words that you just said. Expansive, holistic, we all have different emotional attachments to it and either deepen our relationship to it through recreation, through commercial activity. So I love that the exhibit reflects that. Your breadth of content. Now, I was shared the PDF version of her exhibits, y'all, and it was long, and I loved it. But I mean, you talk about, from the Spanish conquistadors to early Mexican California settlements. We go into Oregon settlers to Alaska. We have the Great Migration from the south and funneling the Alaskan salmon fishermen fleet. We go into research, conservation, labor movements, recreation. This is all me saying you have to go read all that stuff. So, but in that, in terms of partnership, when Northwest Maritime learned of your scholarship, it resonated with our overall mission, which is to engage and educate people of all generations in traditional and contemporary maritime life in a spirit of adventure and discovery. The exhibit contains such a wide breadth of historical accounts from the 1500s to the mid-20th century. How do you start and follow what I imagine was a lot of investigative work?
Yeah, there were times I was like, why did you do this? And I know I'll eventually write a piece of scholarship, my second book, and the book will probably have a much more contained focus. But I started it. I was really fortunate that I had been doing quite a bit of work with Susan Anderson, who's the history curator and program manager at the California African American Museum. And I'd worked with her in the past on some exhibits, one that was looking at Black folks' long relationships to rural spaces in California. That was a banner exhibit like the one that's here. And then I also was the exhibition researcher for a Buffalo Soldiers exhibit that she did in the gallery space there. So that had given me some context on kind of what it means to dive into this kind of work. A lot of it started with just reading. A lot of scholars have done really interesting work on this. So if you're thinking about Black folks in the age of sail, Jeffrey Bolster has his book, Blackjacks. Kevin Dawson out of UC Merced has a really great book that's looking at aquatic traditions in Africa, especially on the West Coast. Skip Finley is a public historian who's done quite a bit of work on Black whalers, and specifically he looks at Black whaling captains in the 19th century. So a lot of it was just reading. And then we've got the internet now. I think about, what scholarship looked like for folks before that. And so that you could just I went on a lot of just deep dive rabbit holes. And then when I would find interesting stories, I would start reaching out to different museums and historical societies and university libraries and groups like this. And then I just physically went into a lot of archives and a lot of museums and research libraries, big and small. I went to the Smithsonian, but then here on the Pacific, I went into each region that I was looking at. So this particular exhibit looks at what's now the U.S. Pacific, so California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii. And so, and then when you talk to different archivists, a lot of times they were just so excited that I was there and looking into this information, and then they knew of something, and then they would recommend that I talk to somebody. So, and I can't even all the way remember how I got connected with you all. I think it might have been the director of Vanishing Sail of that documentary.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
I
so it was
forgot
just
about that.
talking to
Yeah.
people and reaching out to people, and luckily I like people, so that helps. Yeah, and so it was just going into the archives and digging around and poking and prodding. Zilner Hurston says that research is just poking and prodding with a purpose, and that's what I was doing.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to use that.
Yeah.
I mentioned discovery here, and a lot of the images that you see behind us right now are of Caroline in that process, because I'm like, I wanted to be in that moment, and for somehow romanticizing it. I'm like, it's under the cover at night. There's a light bulb, and then she found it. She found her discovery. So I was like,
and thanks for saying that, because I was a little worried. I was like, I've never given a talk where it's just pictures of me up, and I'm like, are people going to think I'm some narcissist? But this was supposed to add context to what the process was like to find all of this.
Totally. And that's what we're here to talk about.
Okay.
All right. This question is not a question. This is a reflection of one of the banners. It's African connections rooted in spirituality with, quote, boats as sites of work and portals to the spiritual world, which, again, I don't know what I'm asking here. I just think it's beautiful. Can you talk about it?
A lot of that came from some of that initial reading that I was talking about. So Jeffrey Bolster's work, he talks quite a bit about the relationship between Black Africans and spirituality, and how some of that even crossed the Atlantic, and that there were folks who were working in the Carolinas and Virginias and some of the rice paddies there and some of those waters, and the way that they would carry some of those spiritual practices onto their work upon the water. And then also Kevin Dawson, the book that I was mentioning about Black folks' relationships to water in Africa, he very much talks about the spiritual nature of these connections. And where this kind of brings us back to that earlier conversation about water and trauma, that yes, that is one part of the story of Black folks on the water, but there's also been these long connections to water being a sacred site, to being the site where ancestors were considered to be on an ancestral plane that was under the water. Things like when The Little Mermaid was just re-released, and there was all of that public outroar. I was in the midst of doing all of this archival research and thinking about spiritual practices, and there was a deity called Mami Wata that was very prevalent in a lot of West African societies, which was basically a mermaid type figure, which isn't surprising. Like if you look at cultures and societies across the world, a lot of times there's these shared types of themes. So there's shared flood stories that you'll see from across civilizations. So water spirits is something that you see in multiple societies, including societies of people of African descent. And so I think it was just important to share that these relationships to water weren't just economic, or weren't even just always just about leisure, that there was also a spiritual component to them as well.
We see that reflected across the indigenous communities here on these lands, right, throughout its entire history.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, and how can you not, just as a human, how can you not look out on the water and be moved in some spiritual capacity? And so
Absolutely.
I think societies across the world over time have done that.
Everyone just take a moment early in the morning and sit with that. Yeah. You can feel it. Yeah. So we've, initially, especially when we first started kind of talking about your work, I mean, my head went to the domestic from California to Alaska, but then I started reading about a lot of the representation of Hawaii too, with the music connections and descriptions on Anthony Allen and Betsy Stockton during their self-emancipation process from slavery in the early 1800s. Can you describe what that research process was like across the Pacific? Yeah,
that was kind of one of the first formal inquiries I started to make. So after I finished my doctoral program, I was in this postdoc, and the COVID had just started, and I was given some research, a small research budget, and was kind of told, however you want to support your research. And I was at first going to do very practical things with it, like, get some media equipment for some of the work that I was doing. But I'd been thinking about Allenby Light and thinking about these Black mariners. And at the same time, I also had a research colleague who was going to be doing, he's Native Hawaiian, and he was going to be doing some research. And so I spent weeks, my family came with me in Hawaii, and was talking to folks, I know, and started going into some of these archives, and And Hawaii is a site because of it being part of the U.S. Pacific, but Black folks were in other areas of Polynesia as well. Also, Hawaii was very important to the project because in addition to the gallery components and the exhibits, I also wanted to work in boat building and using that as a contemporary means to kind of think about these past histories. And I was thinking about the Polynesian Renaissance that happened in the 1970s, and the rebuilding of like Hokulea was a huge inspiration for me. And so that particular site is just really important to the project. And my family and I were there, and the ways that we were being welcomed by so many people in the communities there, it really helped me think about Anthony Allen and Betsy Stockton and folks who went there in the 19th century to make new lives for themselves.
Yeah, that's so special.
Yeah,
That's really
yeah.
cool. So the saltier, maybe even brasher version of me wants to ask this question and talk about your research about the volume of Black whalers. Like, that story was so cool. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, whaling, sailors at sea, generally, life was a bit more, there was more meritocracy on the sea than there was on land. And so you saw that and by the early 19th century, about 20% of the U.S. maritime workforce was of African descent. And in whaling, that went up to about 30% as well, 20 to 30%. Skip Finley, as I was mentioning, has this great book, Whaling Captains of Color. And so whalers were on the Pacific, as we know, especially as a lot of the Atlantic hunting grounds became overfished and overhunted. They were in Hawaii, they were in Alaska, so a lot of the Black whalers who were on those vessels were some of the first U.S. residents to reach the shores of Alaska. These vessels became, these ways that a lot of these sailors found new homes on the Pacific. People often would get off and then never get back on, right? They would desert. That's how some of the first members of the Hawaiian Royal Band under Kamehameha II were African American sailors, and many of them had been on whaling vessels. And so that's just a huge component of the story of Black folks in the Pacific, are a lot of the people who were hunting on the high seas. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, whatever your views are, it's really compelling story.
Yeah, and also, it's important to mention, that means they were also part and parcel of a lot of the activity that led to further indigenous dispossession of land and water life and marine life. And so Black folks have been part of all of those stories. Yeah.
The highlight for me, too, is the story of a whaling captain. His wife was an ecologist. She went on every 5th trip with him, and then their young daughter was this passionate sailor that kind of shadowed her father. And so I just think when we talk about, thinking about that image as a family, that's super moving. So
that's one of my favorite stories is Captain Shorey. He was from Barbados, and his father was a Scottish planter. His mother was a woman from the West Indies. And he found his way to Boston, and then ended up, he came out on, I think, the Merriman, and he ended up being the West Coast's only Black whaling captain. There were quite a few on the East Coast. And his wife loved ecology. She wasn't like a trained ecologist, but she very much loved it. And I just love that the family would go to sea together, which is something that did happen often with captains and their families. And she has this wonderful quote that she gave to a Black newspaper in the 1800s that their daughter Victoria, she was really young at the time, and she said she's quite an accomplished sailor who knows all the ropes and has perfect command of her father.
Thank you for telling that. I want to shift a little bit into the early 20th century. So really talking about laborers here, and in reference to African American workers participating in the Alaska fishing industries, you just spoke a little bit about this, but I want to make it a little clearer for the audience. But in 1926, African Americans made up 20% of the workforce of Alaska's largest salmon canning plant. Eventually, discriminatory employment practices pushed out Black employees, and you mentioned this again within domestic waterfront work, for example. One in every black man in Seattle worked for the Admiral or Alaska steamship line. A little bit of my research through a Japanese-American researcher named Megan Osaka. She released her book 2 years ago, Seattle from the Margins. I'd highly recommend it. She also shows us how Asian and indigenous laborers in this time made up 20% of the workforce. So when we talk about both rural and urban spaces, the history traditionally offered to us does not paint the complexity and rich diversity of folks working within maritime commerce. Your work directly addresses historical erasure and exclusion of Black lives throughout the Pacific. What kind of impact have you seen so far bringing these stories forward?
I think the impact that I've seen is just that people are excited for these stories. I mean, if you were to cut on the news, you would just think that no one wants to hear any of these stories, and there's outrage all over, and that's definitely a component of our society. But going back to that, it's not just either or, but yes and. Yes and we also see there are quite a few people who are interested. People, even if they didn't realize that these gaps were there, when they are seeing how they're highlighted, there's general interest. And I think what I'm really most excited about is when local folks have their own local stories and familial stories that are tied to some of the stories that are told within the exhibit. Mm-hmm. So that's always really exciting to see. And what I'm really hoping in terms of impact is that there was just so much that I could tell, and you can only tell so much, especially in a banner exhibit. I mean, you're really just limited in actual words. Is that this can lead folks to kind of go down internet rabbit holes of their own, to purchase books, watch YouTube videos, that you, for every small little story that you see in the exhibit, you can learn so much more through some of the longer form materials that are out there.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the labor movements. In 1943, well, first in the 30s, we had Black longshoremen excluded from maritime unions, but then were recruited when white labor unions went on strike. In 1943, we had over 200 African-American shipbuilders in California protest against discriminatory hiring policies. That action led to the 1944 California Supreme Court decision, which ruled that jobs requiring labor union membership could not exclude Black people or other racial groups. I mean, this was a massive turning point in shaping today's maritime unions. Maritime economies are huge. It's the third largest in Washington state. While we see systemic discrimination hasn't ended, have you seen evidence in your research that shows movements like these support African-American labor leaders in other industries?
Absolutely, and I think that's something that most folks who look at these histories, not just the maritime histories, but immigration law, to housing discrimination, to employment discrimination, often in the United States, some of these earliest battles have started with African Americans who were protesting or who were seeking different lawsuits or taking legal channels, and generally, these gains have not only benefited African American workers or people who were seeking employment or people who were trying to live in a particular area, they've then helped all groups as well. Yeah, so definitely.
Thank you. All right, shifting a little. You have such amazing representation of Black women throughout this whole exhibit. I mean, it's awesome. I mean, they're either involved in or experts of marine ecology, science, medicine, in the Army. And then just to highlight in World War II, the World War II era women shipbuilders, I wanted to bring out a little stats for the audience. Maritime production cracked discriminatory practices limiting shipbuilding to white men, where 600,000 African-American women found work in offices, factories, and shipyards, which built wartime weapons, planes, and ships. 600,000. What's your favorite story you found so far in this research?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that stat that's in the exhibit. My paternal grandmother was one of those, not in maritime, though, but she was working in aviation during the war, so she was one of the Rosie the Riveters. And if I had to choose one, it would probably be Annie Smalls during World War II. She came from Shreveport, Louisiana, and she was just so determined to reach some of the shipyards in Northern California that she came on a train and there were no seats. I can imagine during that time she was probably in a segregated car, so there might have been available seats elsewhere, but in the car that she was looking for a seat, there were none. And so she sat on her suitcase the entire trip and came from Louisiana to California, got employment in the shipyards, and a wonderful public historian, a community historian, Felicia Gaston up there, has that actual suitcase. And in the gallery exhibit version of this show that'll be at the Maritime Museum of San Diego, hopefully we'll be able to display that suitcase in the show.
So
I think that's one of my favorite stories. Yeah.
That's so cool. Building community. In the early 19th century, you mentioned a black sailor. His name's Alan Irwin Flowers and his wife, Louisa. They were instrumental in supporting the growth of the black community in Portland. So focusing a little bit on Oregon here, but also throughout the coast, particularly in our ports. In spite of segregation, what did support look like within black communities with maritime roots? And how did they support each other? What did that look like, and what examples have you seen?
With the Flowers specifically, they were really instrumental in creating, they were some of the first members of Bethel African American Methodist Episcopal Church. The AME Church is a church that my husband and I grew up in. We don't go to church anymore, but that's a really a church in the black community that has been very active in things like civic movements. So you saw some of these black sailors who were helping to create churches. There were times where they really were heavily involved in unions in Northern California when black folks were barred from union membership in the early 1900s. They often created their own black unions. They didn't have as much cachet or power as some of the other ones did, but it was often in those black unions that they started doing their own organizing that did push to legal channels of desegregating larger unions. You also see times where community was formed in housing, and some either informally where they were all living with one another, or even in some of the housing projects that the government built, especially during World War II efforts when they were having folks come and build wartime ships. Some of these housing units were desegregated, some were segregated, but that was another area where you would see a lot of community building taking place.
Let me make sure I'm keeping up here. I wanted to say this quote. She has so many good quotes, y'all. The ability to choose how and where we spend our free time in many ways lies at the heart of what we understand freedom and opportunity to mean. So it's said by Allison Rose Jefferson, a historian of African American leisure. I want to pivot a little bit from the commercial space within maritime and dive into the art of play and lifestyle inherent to ocean culture, including fishing, pleasure boating, swimming, and surfing. Quote, by enjoying all the Pacific Ocean offered, Black Americans claimed the very promise and tested the constraints of America and the West. You've painted these inherent personal relationships to water, confronted by both discrimination and segregation. Can you describe what this looked like in the era of Jim Crow?
Yeah, so I love that quote from Allison Rose Jefferson, and she writes. She has a book, California Dreaming, that's a lot about Black folks and their relationships to play and leisure on the water. So in Jim Crow, for instance, in California, there were black beach enclaves where folks would go to the water in spaces where they felt that they could be less harassed. One example is this place, Bruce's Beach, which is in Manhattan Beach, California. Some of you might have heard of it now, since in the last couple of years it was the first time that land that had been taken by the government from a black family has ever been returned to one. And so this couple had a beach called Bruce's Beach, where black folks could come and swim. They had swimsuit rentals. They had a small restaurant, and the city of Manhattan Beach took the land by eminent domain because so many neighbors were complaining, because it wasn't just the beach, but there were also black folks who were buying property in the area, and it was becoming a thriving community. And so they took it by eminent domain, which normally means that they're going to do something with the land. But you could tell it was a land grab, very much rooted in discrimination and racism, because for decades the land just sat vacant. They just took it. Eventually, Manhattan Beach did build a lifeguard station on it, and just recently the land was returned to the family, and the family did resell the land so that it could still be available for public use. But it's also just a story of the way in which not only did people want to engage in the water in forms of leisure and play, but just also the generational wealth that was denied by so many black folks who were not either able to buy into a lot of this oceanfront property during Jim Crow, or if they did, they had it physically taken from them.
So you mentioned surfing really early on, the surf boats, and kind of like, it's just wild, all the imagery that's presented that was based out of what is now Ghana, right? Yeah. And then there's an awesome picture, I think your son, right? Showcasing modern surf recreation in Southern California. Are you working with organizations in San Diego or other areas connecting youth of color to water-based activities?
I am. I mean, we want them to know these long histories. Kevin Dawson's work shows that black folks, at least the earliest documented record of them surfing is in the 1600s in what's now Ghana. And then we have folks like Carlotta Lai, who was an educator in Maui in the 1800s, and she was surfing in the early 1900s. So I'm working with groups like Black Like Water and Native Like Water. We have at UC San Diego Black Surf Week coming up next week. And that's open to all folks who want to get on the water and who are interested in stories and histories of black people on the water. The exhibit, when it's in its actual physical form at the Maritime Museum, we're also going to have a Maritime Adventure Academy that's including getting youth on the water with sailing instruction. So we're very much, still so much of this research I'm hoping won't just live within an exhibit or within the pages of the book, but it's very much meant to be applied and meant to get young people and older people and everyone excited about being on the water together and making those maritime spaces welcoming and inviting.
I want to make sure this audience knows too around what your initial kind of aspirations were as well around youth boat building, but I'm going to bring it up after this question. The travel exhibit was made possible with support from California Humanities, which is a nonprofit partner to the National Endowment for the Humanities. Its planning was made possible through one of their major grants called Democracy Demands Wisdom, which I love. What kind of impact, well, that's a different question. Where are you at with your funding, and what are your aspirations with that?
Yeah, so the project, when I was first envisioning it, has exhibits, so like the traveling banner one that you can see downstairs in the boathouse. We also have a physical gallery exhibit that's going to be at the Maritime Museum of San Diego, and that's through funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The California African American Museum, which is a state-run institution in LA, they're going to hopefully take it after it's in San Diego. And I'm still, though, trying to get funding for a vessel build. That was one of the things we asked for, and we got funding from the NEH, but we got reduced funding. So as I was mentioning, I want this to be a lived, embodied experiment. So I'm hoping to be able to build a 28 to find a black boat, right? Which is why I was at TWSBA to build a 28-foot wooden whaleboat with black and indigenous youth, since, as we mentioned earlier, so many black folks did engage in whaling. And also to just be this way in the 21st century to kind of repair some of the harm that black folks were part of in overhunting and overfishing, to then take that boat out as an educational vessel to go do things like whale whispering and whale watching and have a different relationship with whales as opposed to hunting.
I love that. Yeah, we talked a lot about, and I'd make that plug because there's a lot of people in this campus and across the grounds that would be more than happy to support you in that. So take that as a call to action, please, and pass on the word. In terms of public history, which is very important, and has shaped a lot of my background and how I approach my work. You have in the exhibit, you have artifacts that humanizes these experiences in a way that not all historical research does. It's accessible, it's relatable, it connects to all audiences. Do you have a favorite?
Oh, that's hard. It's like choosing your children, right? I think my favorite actually isn't downstairs. It's not in the traveling exhibit, but it'll be in the physical exhibit, and it's a compass that belonged to Charles and Nancy Alexander. And they were African-American homesteaders in Missouri and left in the early to mid 1800s seeking further freedom. And they came overland first by wagon to California and kind of felt they had found their oasis, right? And then in 1851, with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, that irreparably changed their outlook on California, because now the government had passed a law that even if you made it to a quote-unquote free state, enslavers could come and capture you. Also, black folks were not able to testify in court at this time in the United States. So even if you were to say, I'm not enslaved by that person, I don't even know this person, someone could come and legally take you and remove you. So they again made the decision to try to find new homes elsewhere. And this is before things like Yelp and Zillow, right? People were just talking word of mouth, reading black newspapers. And at the same time in California, a group of black folks were looking further north in the Pacific and thinking about settling in British Columbia. So he was a carpenter, Charles Alexander. They had their chest that he had built. They had a family Bible, and they had this small compass. And they then took to the sea. They were part of a group of a couple hundred black folks who left out of San Francisco by a sailing vessel and went up to Victoria and were part of the first black community there. And so that compass, I think, is probably my favorite object because of just the faith that it represents.
It makes me emotional when you said that, like, whew, keep it together. So in reference to the physical space housing your work, we had Jefferson County Historical Society and Northwest Maritime work together to stage the exhibit at the festival here. There was alignment over accessibility and the shared belief that public history is not meant just to live within exhibits and museums, but takes place everywhere. Can you comment on how this work plays a role in that?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that I think we all do think of history outside of the walls of academia and professors, and we all, anytime you're talking story with one another and listening to your elders and listening to your neighbors and friends tell their own stories, that's history, right? And we're making history constantly together, and so I think it's very important that we think that these types of exhibitions can take place anywhere, including in a boat house. And I think, in fact, I mean, that's just the sensory experience when I was down there, and you could smell the lumber and see the ocean. I mean, to me, I think there is no better venue to tell this type of story.
I could have said that better. It's so good. I'm totally biased. Boathouse is incredible. And I hope everyone here is going to take an opportunity to really do their due diligence, take pictures, take it home, show your family members. I want to open it up for Q&A, but before I do that, I want to ask what's next for you. I mean, you're on a deadline right now. I know that. And I also want to make sure that I ask you, what do you want the community to know?
Yeah, I mean, what's next? Yeah, I'm writing another, being an academic, I also have to write dusty things that 10 or 12 other people will read in a journal. I think what I hope people take from this is, one, just how huge the story is. That's part of why it was such a huge geographic scope and so over such a huge amount of time. I didn't want people to see just one of these stories and think it was just a blip or some type of anomaly. I hope you walk away knowing that Black folks have had these long, rich experiences with the Pacific over a long time, over a lot of geographic space in all kinds of interesting ways. And I hope that you find something in the exhibit that just excites you and makes you go down some really weird rabbit hole, and you get all kinds of books and watch videos and just experience the story in a deeper way on your own.
Awesome. Oh, okay. Do we have questions? Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Caroline. You can choose.
What's a maritime experience of your own that brought you joy or meaning?
I think being on the water as a kid, I mean, my mom used to set up the playpen and I would be in it while my older siblings were in the Pacific and San Diego. And then as a parent myself, just my husband and I and our boys just love the water. And so they surf a lot, I boogie board, we snorkel. I mean, we just love being in and on it. And so I think more of the leisure component is probably the one that's been and really embodied. Has been what's been probably my most memorable. Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't seen the exhibit yet, so you may have covered this already, but I know railway porters were a job that were open to Black workers. Did that extend to steamship lines?
Yes. Yeah. And there were a lot of stewards. And downstairs in the exhibit, there is a brochure of one of those vessels, and also a quote of what the daily life was like, just how early they were up. And so like porters, it was a job where there was some accessibility. You could enter that form of employment, but it was a job that also took you places, and you could see lots of things. And so it also helped change a lot of our migration and settlement practices as well. Because people were out experiencing the world through some of these commercial vessels. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
What a fabulous talk. I did my best to get here at the outset, but talking about the Black people working in Alaska, were they recruited or was it a migration?
Yeah.
What was that? And if they were recruited, why were they ultimately shunned?
A little bit of both. So some folks went up on their own, especially people who were fleeing enslavement in some points. For the ones that were working in Alaska's fisheries, they were recruited. That did not last very long because of some of the workers who were already there, and so because of some discriminatory practices, many were pushed out. Some of those African American workers who came in, they were already replacing a workforce that had been pushed out, largely people of Asian descent. And then also same with both the canneries and then people who were actively fishing on the waters as well. That was through a large scale recruitment effort. And so there were some people who were on the Star of India and the Balclutha. And I think that was maybe about 300 Black workers who were recruited for that effort.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. First, I just want to thank you, Dr. Collins, for doing really important work. I feel such grief and such beauty over the work that you're doing. My question is probably a little too general, so forgive me for not having specific enough information, but according to one of my teachers, in the very early colonization of the United States, there were many circumstances where African polyglots were basically kidnapped or coerced into basically being dropped off on the coast somewhere and instructed at threats to themselves or threats to their families to go into the interior and to learn the languages of whomever was indigenous to those regions. And then there would be a specified pickup place somewhere down the coast or somewhere else, and by way of them gathering information on those regions or on those tribes that they could use in trade or whatever it might be. And for such an early time, I would imagine there may or may not be any records, but I just wondered if in your research you've come across anything that would suggest any of that.
Yeah, I don't know necessarily about the specific, the pickups and the drop-offs, but the exhibit does talk to the fact that so many people of African descent were engaged in a lot of that early colonial activity, especially in Spanish and Portuguese projects. As you mentioned, many of them were polyglots, and you see Matthew Riestall is a historian who does quite a bit of work on that as well, and he talks about since the beginning of Spanish colonization that people of African descent were both involuntary colonists and voluntary. There were folks who, like Juan Garrido, there's an image of him in the exhibit downstairs that was done by Native peoples who told their history pictorially, who was one of these early black conquistadors. Many of them were enslaved. Some came voluntarily as the maritime world really expanded. They came out of ports in West Africa and did join a lot of these colonial parties. And so it's a very complicated history, and there were times where life on the water was opening up certain types of opportunity for black people, but sometimes that opportunity did come at the expense of being part of these larger colonial practices as well. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered, is there an exhibit in Victoria or Vancouver that's worth seeing?
I know that at the Victoria Harbor, they have a monument, I think there is a plaque that talks about the first black settlers. And then up in Saanich, there's a small historical society, this log house pioneer society. They in their archives hold the compass of the Alexanders, but on public display is his chest that he built, as well as some of their other items that they brought out with them, and I believe a photo of them in their 50th wedding anniversary. So, yeah.
I'm from Vancouver, Canada.
Oh,
And I've never heard anything about the migration up to Victoria. Do know about the Salt Spring Islanders because some descendants were still there,
Yep.
of course. But Victoria being more English than the English at the time that you're talking about, I just wonder whether they were able to get real roots in Victoria, or they had to, as you say, shove off up the peninsula further and head out to the islands because of being basically what the heck is going on, by the local populace.
yeah. From what I know, I do believe a lot did go up further north, and some of those early pioneers also came back to the United States. Not all stayed. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Excellent.
Yeah.
You mentioned next steps, and some of that might be involve writing a highly academic research paper that only 12 or 15 people read. Curious about how you might communicate. You mentioned also earlier that you might be writing a book.
Yeah.
And also how do people like me, that I might not read your paper, how do I learn more?
Yeah, I'm working on my first book right now in Old Town San Diego State Historic Park, but the press is interested in this as well. So at years down the line, I do hope to write a book that's both scholarly in nature, but also just really more mainstream and something that we all would want to read and kind of have on our coffee table. Yeah. So, but in the meantime, the exhibit will continue to travel, and if we're able to build the boat, we also want to build a documentary around that as well. Yeah. Yeah. I think I saw on this side first, and then right. Was it you I saw first? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for your talk. It really brought an awareness to me of how little I know about the fullness of the history of different industries, not just the maritime industry, but like I live in Ellensburg and we have a lot of cattlemen and cowboys. And so how do we ask the right questions, or are there ways, like I'm not an archivist or researcher, but I would love to connect, understand what questions we should be asking when we don't even know where to start about like what is the fullness of the history of what we're participating in that we might not know about.
Yeah, I mean, like in the American West, you know, and in places in Texas, 1 in 4 cowboys were African American. Like Jeffrey Katz, I think that's his first name, has work on the Black West. Also Quintard Taylor also writes about the Black West, and Jack Forbes. And then also Google, you know, like the internet is really helpful. It might, you know, and we all want to be media literate, and I think, you know, if it seems a little crazy, it might be, but you also can find, you know, books and documentaries and then your local historical societies and small museums. You know, there's folks who have dedicated their lives to collecting a lot of these materials, and they are really excited to talk to people about them. Yeah.
So to follow up on that, I've been trying to note things on my phone.
Yeah.
But is there any sort of curated bibliography or research guide?
Yeah, I don't know if we have it I think for this stop, I think at some of our first ones we didn't, but I know that I put together a recommended book list, and so I can find out if it is at this stop as well, because that was something we just recently did put together, that kind of curated all of those different books. Yeah.
And just to add on to that, I think we're going to plan to add this interview onto YouTube, and so we'll be sure to add the recommended book list into the notes, into the show notes.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned needing funding, and I'm sure that my partner feels like I do. You know, it's definitely worth contributing to. So, and I think there are a lot of people in this area who would. Do you have a nonprofit? Is there, you know, I guess a little bit more specific information about how to support the project?
Yeah, we can. We're able to go through my university, the University of California at San Diego, and so that's one arm as well. And then I also work with the Maritime Museum, or if we were to build here in the Northwest, then we would partner with Northwest Maritime Center. So there's different places. Yeah.
I know that one goal of mine when I talk to Caroline is that I want to keep Caroline doing what she does because it's important, and having been in connection with this nonprofit and many nonprofits across the nation, not just on the West Coast, it's our responsibility to cooperate around how we use our skill set to support her. Well, I think this has been amazing. It's like amazing opportunity for all of us. We're going to go ahead and wrap things up, but I do want to take the opportunity to, on behalf of Northwest Maritime and the folks in this room, to applaud you, the scholars before you. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Special. I think that we can all agree that it's of course, it's been a continuation, but also the beginnings too, around shifting the narrative to recognize and celebrate the broader and more nuances of Black communities in the Pacific. So thank you, and thank everyone.
Thank you so much.